Hi, everyone. Welcome to part 2 of tonight's Devil's Advocate. John Caldera is off on vacation, so I'm told, something like that. I'm Todd Shepherd filling in. Glad to have you with us on CPT 12. Tonight, very glad to have this next guest with me. From an investigative reporter's standpoint, this is someone that I really look up to and I really admire his work. And tonight we'll be talking all things Denver Police Department. So we welcome into Devil's Advocate Brian Maass from Channel 4.
Thank you very much. Thank you for the kind words. I appreciate it.
Happy to have you here. Your first time on Devil's Advocate too, right?
This is my first time on your program, absolutely.
Real quick, since this is your first time, give us sort of the 30 to 40 second Brian Maass bio.
I work at CBS4 in Denver. I've been there about 31 years. Started pretty low on the totem pole, progressed, carved out a pretty good role as an investigative reporter, and I've been doing that for a really long time. Love what I do, have passion, enjoy my job, wake up every day looking forward to it.
And I think that length of time, and we throw around the word institutional knowledge a lot in the journalism business, but I mean, obviously 30 years at CBS4, you've got it, and I think that's what makes you a specialist with the Denver Police Department. I mean, I was in this studio a couple of months ago. We were filming Colorado Inside Out, and we brought up the Denver Police Department, and then later I said, you know, Maass has got so many sources, and everybody rolled their eyes, and they rolled their eyes in jealousy. You know what I'm saying? Because I think Chief White actually gets his news from Brian Maass sometimes. Do you think he ever gets a little frustrated with you like that?
Oh, I know they get frustrated all the time. But I actually feel like I have a really good relationship with the police department, oddly enough.
I do too, yeah.
You know, they may not be happy with the stories that we dig up and that we get.
Right.
But I think they know that those stories are pretty well put together, that we've dotted our I's, we've crossed our T's, and that they're solid by the time I actually call the police department for any kind of response or any kind of comment. I think we usually have our facts pretty well in a row by that time.
So looking at Denver police over the last year, first of all, a story you broke July 20th, 2015 that I see from the CBS website. You're talking about Denver Police Department reassignments, and specifically we're talking about some commanders that got demoted and some, was it lieutenants that got promoted to commander? And what was the overall effect of that?
Well, that was a big reshuffling of the command ranks of the Denver Police Department. Sergeants, lieutenants, commanders. Like you said, they did demote a couple of commanders.
How many people are we talking total here?
Oh, it was dozens. It was dozens. Okay. It was a very widespread. It had been talked about for quite a while that it was coming up, and a lot of people were on pins and needles waiting for those changes. They moved commanders around from district to district. Like I said, they did demote some people. They brought some people up. And it was interesting because I did talk to the police department, talk to Chief White and his people about why they did this. And at one point I was told that Chief White simply doesn't like complacency and feels like a lot of people had gotten too comfortable and too complacent, and he needed to shake things up. So they made these moves. I think there was probably a grander motive of putting the right people in the right place and moving the department forward. So that's what that was all about. But it was a pretty big shakeup.
If we go back about 10 months, that's when things really started to percolate with the department. It really more in terms of how they interface with the community. And I don't want to say like, look, they've had their problems like the D. Herrera incident where it was sort of the couple of DPD officers and the one citizen. But now we're talking about where there was sort of this broad citizen unrest that was being displayed when the kids from East High, the students at East High walked out. And then that culminated in a couple of months later in February, there was this march and the fallen officers memorial was defaced, and Chief White told those officers that were there to stand down. Have you seen a lasting effect morale-wise? I know the police union isn't always the best barometer. I mean, right? Sometimes they
well, they're a predictable barometer.
And predictable is right. Like if you want, you know, that's what you want from the umpire in baseball, right? Your strike zone can be wrong as long as it's predictably wrong, right?
Right.
But what was your sort of net feeling on the effect of morale that had at the time, and has it lasted?
That was a really big deal.
Right.
Back in February, like you said, those protesters came down, they poured red paint on the fallen officers memorial. It really struck at the heart for a lot of Denver cops. That memorial means a lot to them. It symbolizes so much. I mean, it symbolizes the ultimate sacrifice that officers have made over the years. So what was so key about that was they knew these protesters were coming. They had plenty of officers assembled nearby who could have stepped in. But the order was given, like you said, to stand down, and they allowed that protest to take place. and consequently they allowed a couple of these protesters to dump this red paint symbolizing blood on the fallen officer's memorial. Officers were really outraged because they weren't allowed to step in and they weren't allowed to stop this. It was a huge issue for them. Chief White explained that they had sort of a quasi-new policy that we're seeing across the country too, of not jumping into the middle of things like this, hot demonstrations that could turn into riots, where you'd amplify things by jumping in there and starting to arrest people. They felt like it was better to sit back, single the people out, pick them out who did it, and then pick them off later and arrest them. And that's what they did with these guys. They did arrest them later, and they were brought to justice. But that didn't really matter to the police officers.
Cops, right.
They were just crestfallen that this had been allowed to happen. And I think what happened there is you already had a huge cadre of officers who don't like Chief White. It solidified their feelings. You maybe had some in the middle who weren't quite so sure and were kind of neutral about Chief White. And then you have some who like Chief White. But really across the spectrum, no matter how they felt about the chief, they were just really troubled by that tactic of letting these protesters come in and deface the memorial.
So I know, look, we're talking to you as a reporter, but I'm asking you to just sort of give your gut feelings on some of these things. So I understand if some of these things are harder to answer because it's not exactly like putting together a report like you would for Channel 4. But when you talk about this cadre of officers that maybe doesn't like Chief White, would you find the same population percentage-wise that didn't like Chief Whitman, or is it bigger under Chief White? I mean, I guess what I'm asking, is the discontent, is it more of a problem behind the scenes right now for DPD?
Well, I think it is. Yeah. And I think you've seized upon something that's really important too, because Chief White was brought in as a change officer. He was brought in to change that culture, to change that environment, something that honestly hadn't happened for decades.
Right.
Even if they modernize equipment, if they make some changes here and there, he was brought in to make a cultural change.
And because Whitman was Whitman was as homegrown as it comes, right? I mean, he was a born and raised Denver officer promoted from within, right? Unlike White.
He had come from Lakewood, but he had been in Denver a long time. He was from within the department.
Right.
And he was thought of being kind of progressive, kind of modernizing the department, but not really bringing about the cultural changes that Chief White was brought in to make within the department. So before he ever got to Denver from Kentucky, they already didn't like him because he had done the same thing at his past department. He was a guy brought in to shake things up. So people were nervous here. They were unhappy about the selection before he ever got here. So that once he got here, and after a few months, he started to make the changes that made people really uncomfortable. So it's been a tough road for him, and it's been a tough road for a lot of the officers too.
When I started off earlier about the sort of the winter of discontent, I mentioned the East High walkout. In that incident, Officer John Asdit very seriously injured. From all of your reporting, it seems like you have a close relationship to Asdit and his family. Any sort of update on how he's doing these days and how he's progressing?
He's much improved. I mean, that's a guy, Officer Asdit, after he got hit by that car.
He was in the hospital for like 2 months, right?
He was in the hospital for a long time, and in the early going, it was very bleak.
It was very bleak,
A lot of people around him, a lot of officers close to him thought he wasn't going to make it. They really did not think that he was going to live. But not only did he live and pull through, I mean, he's walking, he's talking, he's doing pretty well.
That's amazing.
It really is kind of an amazing comeback story for Officer Asdit.
You had an interesting story the other day, and may not be ground-shaking in it by any terms, but I think it's always interesting, and I think it's always great journalism when the public's able to keep up on the technology that DPD is using. First of all, they're adding these fingerprint scanners. Tell me about that and how big an effect you think that might have.
Yeah, it's not really the newest technology in the world. It's been used in other places, but good for Denver because they've got about $250,000 from next year's budget to get these mobile fingerprint scanners in a lot of patrol cars. And what that allows officers to do is right on the spot, because they get lied to all the time. So many of these criminals lie about who they are to try to get out of the arrest. Now they're going to be able to fingerprint them right on the spot with these electronic mobile fingerprint devices, establish what their identity is, if they have warrants on them. And so it should put maybe more bad guys in jail, but maybe more importantly, it's going to cut down on the number of incorrect arrests. And that's been a huge problem before, of putting the wrong people in jail. This should help that.
You know, one of the last stories I did before I left KOA as a general assignment reporter there was this young lady. She had been a victim of criminal record identity theft. A friend she grew up with got pulled over, didn't have a license on her, and she knew she had been arrested several times. I mean, she knew how lengthy her history was. She used her friend's name and birth date, and she was booked into that, and she bonded out as that. And this young lady who had been victimized, she didn't find out till 6 months later. So I think you're absolutely right that it really puts that problem, ameliorates it incredibly.
It should really help out being able to officially establish who the officer is dealing with right there. So things like what happened to that young lady don't keep happening.
Right, and in fact that happened in a different jurisdiction. I don't want to pin that on or make it seem like I'm blaming DPD for that. Another piece of technology, this one obviously on the forefront of technology, body cameras. And the interesting thing that Denver did the other day in terms of off-duty officers, I mean, what's your sense about how the department is doing and moving along on incorporating that, and how the officers are feeling about these rules?
Well, they brought these body cameras in as kind of a pilot project in the last couple of years. They like the results so far. I think they've got about $6 million to basically get body cameras for all the officers, and there is discussion now about having officers wear them for their secondary jobs, their off-duty jobs. So that's what you're talking about there. But you know, the technology, another technology that's not particularly new and it's not particularly cutting edge, but it's incredibly effective. And the theory why police departments are generally amenable to having these body cameras is because most of the time the footage that's collected from the body cameras will exonerate the officers when somebody says, oh, he did this or she did that.
Police brutality, he slammed me into the car.
Well, let's take a look at the tape.
Right.
And it usually does end up exonerating the officers. There have already been cases, though, in Denver where those body cameras have not worked in favor of the police, where it's shown things that have gotten officers in trouble. So it does cut both ways, but probably for the most part, probably helps the cops.
Got about 20 seconds. How do you think, though, the rank and file are reacting to this decision for the body cameras to be worn in off-duty situations?
You know, I haven't talked to a lot of officers about wearing those in secondary jobs and off-duty. But the reality is a lot of bad things happen when these officers work at bars at closing time. We've seen that over and over and over again.
Donnie Young in 2005, tragically.
Yeah. In theory, it seems like it's probably a good idea.
Brian Maass, a pleasure to have you on. Thanks, man.
Thanks for having me.
Keep up the good work.
Thank you.
Thanks for joining us tonight on Devil's Advocate on CPT 12. I'm Todd Shepherd for John Caldera.